She thought no one was listening. Just another day, another silent patient. But as her voice filled the quiet room, a broken man watched from behind the glass, and in that moment, everything began to change. The hallway was quiet except for the faint sound of wheels rolling rubber soles squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. Maya adjusted the hem of her pale blue uniform and nudged open the door to room 212 with her elbow. The room smelled faintly of lavender oil, something she'd started placing under the bed weeks ago. The scent helped her feel like someone still cared. Mr. Alden lay there, as he always did, pale, silent. A soft hissing sound came from the oxygen machine beside his bed. His eyes were closed, his skin paper-thin and translucent around the knuckles. He hadn't spoken a word since she arrived at the facility. Some of the other nurses treated him like a chore, another task to complete before lunch. But Maya didn't see a shell. She saw a person, a man who had lived, worked, laughed, and been loved once. She pulled the chair closer and placed the warm washcloth gently against his forehead. "Good morning, Mr. Alden," she whispered, even though he never replied. The roses out front finally bloomed. Took them long enough. She dipped the cloth again and moved to his hands, speaking to him like he could hear every word. And then, almost without thinking, she began to hum. The tune wasn't one she'd planned. It was just something her mother used to sing when days felt heavy. A lullaby with no name. Something about it always brought her peace, and she hoped maybe foolishly it brought something to him too. She didn't know that behind the tinted observation glass. A man stood still. His hands were tucked in his coat pockets, but his eyes didn't move. Julian Alden hadn't stepped foot into his father's room in months, not since they wheeled him in, unconscious and fading. He'd told himself it was enough just to cover the medical bills, to fund the best care, to delegate the responsibility. But now, standing in the shadowed hallway, he couldn't look away from the woman who spoke to his father like he was still here. Maya continued humming as she arranged the pillows behind Mr. Alden's back, carefully lifting his shoulders. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who had done this for years, but still cared like it was her first day. She didn't notice Julian. She wasn't performing. When she leaned closer and gently adjusted the oxygen tube behind the old man's ear, she whispered, "You don't have to talk, but just know you're not alone. Not while I'm here." Julian blinked slowly. The words were meant for his father, but somehow they reached him too. He shifted his weight and stepped back from the window, almost ashamed of his spying. But something about the way she moved, unhurried, intentional, soft, made him pause again just outside the doorway. He had meetings to get to, emails piling up, decisions only he could make, but he didn't leave. Maya began folding the blanket at the foot of the bed. As she tucked in the corners, she returned to her humming, quieter this time, nearly a whisper. The kind of sound meant for healing, not notice. She'd been taught to believe that small kindnesses mattered most when no one was watching. She had no idea someone had been watching all along. Julian sat stiffly in the administrator's office, barely touching the coffee placed in front of him. The cup had long gone cold, but he hadn't noticed. His gaze kept drifting toward the small monitor on the desk, showing the hallway outside room 212. It was a grainy feed, black and white, but even without color, he recognized the figure moving gently around the bed. "Your father's condition hasn't changed much." The administrator, Mrs. Hartley, said gently, tapping a few keys on her laptop. "Stable but non-responsive. We continue with hydration therapy, bed mobility, and emotional care. Miss Rivera has taken the lead with him these last few months. Miss Rivera, Julian asked without looking up. The caregiver you saw, Maya, she's special. Mrs. Hartley replied with a softness in her voice that surprised even her. She sings to the patients, talks to them like their family. Some staff think she's wasting time, but I think maybe she's the only one getting it right. Julian said nothing. His fingers traced the rim of the porcelain cup as memories flooded him. His father's booming voice years ago, full of command, always telling him to do more, be more. And now that voice was gone, replaced by silence and the hum of machines. He stood abruptly. I'll go sit with him. Mrs. Hartley looked surprised but nodded. Of course, take all the time you need. Julian walked slowly through the corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a pale glow on the sterile walls, and each step felt heavier than the last. Outside room 212, he paused, watching Maya once again from the open door. She didn't see him. She was fluffing the pillow under the old man's head, speaking softly to him about her bus ride that morning and the little boy who'd offered her a lollipop because she looked a little sad. Her voice was calm, her presence steady. She placed a hand on Mr. Alden's shoulder, not for any medical reason, just to let him know she was there. Julian stepped inside, clearing his throat. Maya turned quickly, startled but composed. Oh, hello, she said, her eyes searching his face. She didn't recognize him. I'm Julian. His son. A moment passed between them, not awkward but real. She nodded slowly, and something shifted in her expression, as if pieces had just clicked into place. I'm Maya, she said simply. He nodded, then looked at his father. The man seemed smaller than he remembered, shrunken beneath blankets and time. He doesn't know I'm here. I think. Maybe he does, Maya said gently, her voice never breaking its calm rhythm. Sometimes people don't speak with words anymore. Julian sat in the chair by the window. He didn't know what he was doing there. He had always been more comfortable behind desks, in boardrooms, where control was measurable. Here, he felt exposed. Maya returned to tidying the nightstand, giving him space. She didn't try to fill the silence. She just let it exist. After a while, Julian spoke again. Why do you sing to him? She glanced at him, then back at the drawer she was closing. Because someone should. Because it matters. And maybe because I wish someone had done the same for my mother when she was in a place like this. Julian didn't respond, but the truth in her words settled deep in his chest. From that day on, he came more often. Sometimes he sat in silence. Sometimes he watched from the window. But always, it was Maya's voice, soft, steady, unwavering, that he remembered when he walked away. And though she still didn't know the depth of the grief he carried, he began to feel that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Julian returned to his office the next morning, but something felt different. The floor-to-ceiling windows no longer impressed him. The emails waiting in his inbox no longer felt urgent. He stared at the framed photos on his desk, images of corporate milestones, magazine covers, handshakes with powerful men, but none of them included his father. None of them included family. That night, he drove back to the care facility without thinking. No appointment, no plan. He told himself he was only checking in, but he knew better. When he entered room 212, it was quiet. The lights were dimmed. Maya wasn't there. His father lay still, eyes closed, breathing slow. Julian stood for a long moment, unsure of whether to sit or speak. Eventually, he lowered himself into the same chair Maya always used and leaned forward. I don't know if you can hear me, he began, voice hoarse from disuse. They say people in your condition, sometimes they can So maybe I'll talk anyway. He looked at the folds of the blanket, the way the IV line curled like a delicate thread. You used to say I didn't understand responsibility, that I took things for granted. Maybe you were right. I didn't come back when Mom died. I barely called. And when you got sick, he trailed off. The truth hung in the air. There had been no last conversation, no closure, just silence, then more silence. I didn't say goodbye, he whispered, pressing his palms together. I told myself it wouldn't matter, that it was too late to fix anything. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Maya peeked in with a gentle smile. Didn't mean to interrupt. I can come back later. No, please, stay. She stepped in with a fresh blanket folded over her arm. Cold nights lately, she said as she draped it gently across the old man's legs. Then she turned to Julian. It's okay if you don't know what to say. Some people come in here just to sit. He looked at her, studying the way she made even the smallest gestures feel sacred. Do you really think he hears all this? Maya paused. I think people hear love, whether it's in words or silence. Julian didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling. He never said it. You know, not once. That he was proud of me? Not at the graduation, not after I built the company, not even after the IPO. Just nothing. Maya folded her hands in front of her. My mom used to say some people were raised during wars that didn't end. They forget how to show softness, but it doesn't mean they didn't feel it. Julian turned that over in his mind. He couldn't remember the last time someone had said something that felt like truth without trying to impress him. Not in a meeting, not in a relationship, not even in therapy. He stayed until late that evening, longer than he'd intended, when he finally stood to leave. Maya walked him to the hallway. Thank you, he said, hesitating before the door. For what? For treating him like someone still here. She smiled faintly. That's because he is. Julian walked into the cool night with something unfamiliar pressing against his chest. Not grief exactly, not guilt, but the sense that something was starting to shift, and that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to learn how to show up. The next day, Julian returned earlier than usual. He didn't tell anyone. No calls, no meetings canceled. He simply didn't show up to them. For the first time in years, he let the day unfold without scheduling it. When he arrived at room 212, the door was half open. From the hallway, he saw Maya seated beside his father, holding a small spoon in one hand and a bowl of soup in the other. Her voice was low, almost melodic, as she coaxed gently. Just a little more today. Mr. Alden, you're doing fine. His father, of course, gave no response. His eyes were half-lidded, body limp, but Maya kept going, wiping his mouth softly between spoonfuls, her other hand resting reassuringly on his shoulder. Julian stood silently in the doorway until she looked up. Oh, she said, startled again by his quiet arrival. Didn't expect you so early. I had time, Julian replied, stepping inside, didn't want to wait. Maya nodded and shifted to make room for him beside the bed. She placed the soup bowl on the tray and offered him a seat. He hesitated, then sat down. They were quiet for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't heavy, but unsure. Two people orbiting the same pain, but still unsure how to speak from within it. Eventually, Maya spoke first. He ate 3 spoonfuls today. That's more than yesterday. Sometimes it's like that. The smallest things feel like a victory. Julian looked at his father. He hated soup. He said, almost smiling, said it wasn't real food unless you could chew it. Maya chuckled. Well, he may not be chewing, but he's still being stubborn. Julian leaned forward, brushing invisible dust from the edge of the blanket. He used to make me try split pea soup every winter. Every time. I hated it, but he insisted it built character. Maya glanced at him. Is that what he wanted from you? Character. Julian shrugged. Achievement. I think excellence. I spent most of my life trying to impress him, and now that I've done it, I'm not sure it matters anymore. Maya let his words settle before replying. It matters. Maybe not the way you hoped, but it matters. He looked at her then. Really looked. There was no judgment in her face, just presence, calm. He realized she was younger than he'd thought. Maybe in her late 20s, but there was something ancient about the way she carried herself, as if she'd lived through more than her years should allow. Julian stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting soft orange light over the trees. He spoke without turning around. What made you do this work? You seem too bright for a place like this. Maya didn't answer immediately. She moved to clean the tray, placing the bowl on a cart, wiping the spoon with deliberate care. My mother was here once, she said finally. Different facility, same kind of room. I was 17. They didn't treat her like a person, just a dying body. I swore I'd never let anyone feel that way again if I could help it. Julian turned. Her voice hadn't cracked, but her eyes were far away, as if looking back at something she never wanted to forget or forgive. Your mother must have been proud, he said. I hope so, Maya whispered. As the room dimmed, she adjusted the blinds and turned on the bedside lamp. A warm glow filled the space. For a moment, Julian thought it almost looked like a home, not a hospital, not a place where things ended, but a place where something, maybe something small and fragile, could begin. He stayed longer than he meant to again, not because he needed to, but because the silence no longer frightened him. Not with Maya in the room. It was late afternoon when Julian arrived the next time. The weather had turned. A soft drizzle tapped against the windows as if the sky was trying to speak in its own quiet language. Julian stepped into room 212 without knocking, instinctively wiping his damp hands on the inside of his coat pocket. Maya was already there, sitting beside his father, a worn paperback in her hands. Her voice was low and rhythmic as she read aloud. She didn't stop when Julian entered, just looked up briefly and offered a faint nod before returning to the page. He stood for a moment, unsure of whether to speak, then quietly took the seat by the window. The story she read wasn't dramatic, something about a man fixing an old boat along the coast, but her voice made it feel like something sacred. Julian didn't care about the plot. He just listened to the softness, to the patience, to the care she folded into every word. When she finally closed the book and placed it on the nightstand, she glanced at him. You're early again. I wanted to hear the ending. He said, it wasn't the truth, not exactly, but it was close enough. She smiled gently, then turned back to Mr. Alden and brushed a loose strand of gray hair away from his temple. He moved his fingers earlier. She said, just a little. Could have been nothing. Could have been something. Julian leaned forward. Is that normal? Sometimes the body remembers before the mind does. Or maybe he was just reaching for something. The rain picked up outside. Julian stood and crossed the room, pulling the second chair, her chair, closer to the bed. He didn't ask if he could. He just did it. Maya didn't stop him. They sat together in silence, facing the man who had shaped both of their lives in very different ways. Julian looked at his father's still form, the way the sheets rose and fell with each shallow breath. Then he said, I always thought he was invincible. He used to chop firewood in the snow without gloves. said it toughened the skin. Maya gave a soft laugh. And now here we are, rubbing lotion on his hands twice a day, just to keep them from cracking. Julian let out something close to a chuckle. Life is cruel. Life is humbling, she replied. He looked at her then, curious. Do you ever get used to it? The dying Maya considered the question, folding her hands in her lap. You never get used to it, but you get better at sitting with it, at not running away from it. Julian nodded slowly, absorbing her words. The storm outside cast long shadows across the walls. The room felt like a world of its own, separated from time, from ambition, from everything that had once defined him. He reached out and placed his hand on his father's. It felt unfamiliar at first, like touching something from another lifetime. But then, something loosened in his chest. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just stayed there. Maya didn't interrupt. She simply stood, stepped aside, and turned on the small radio in the corner. A soft jazz melody filled the room. The kind of music Julian remembered from Sunday mornings as a child, when the world felt safe and his father was still the tallest man he knew. They sat there in silence for a long time, the storm outside wrapping the building in gray. But inside room 212, something was changing. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly, like a chair being pulled closer 1 inch at a time. The air in room 212 was warmer than usual, filled with the faint scent of chamomile oil. Maya had changed the diffuser that morning, hoping to ease the tension that often clung to the walls. Julian arrived just past noon, earlier than she expected. She looked up from where she was adjusting his father's pillows. You're making a habit of this, she said gently. Julian gave a small, tired smile. I think it's already a habit. He walked to the foot of the bed, glancing down at the man who had once towered over him like a mountain. Now, Mr. Alden looked impossibly small beneath the blankets. Fragile in a way Julian had never thought possible. Maya stepped aside to give him space but didn't leave. Julian didn't ask her to. He sat down slowly. His hands fidgeted in his lap. After a long silence, he spoke not to Maya, not really to his father, but somewhere in between. He wasn't always like this. Maya looked at him. She didn't interrupt. He was strong. Too strong. Sometimes. The kind of man who shook hands like he was testing your bones. Never missed a day of work. Never missed a deadline. But birthdays? Julian shook his head, a hollow laugh escaping his throat. Forgot mine 3 years in a row. Maya crossed her arms gently, listening. She didn't offer sympathy, just presence. Julian went on. When I was a kid, I used to sit on the stairs waiting for him to come home. I'd draw pictures all day just to show him. He'd come in, tired, briefcase in hand, loosen his tie and barely glance at them. He blinked. One day, I stopped drawing. There was silence between them. Not uncomfortable, just real. Then Maya spoke, her voice quiet but steady. My dad left when I was 8. She said, I used to think that hurt more. But later, I realized it hurts in a different way when someone stays and still feels so far. Julian looked at her, eyes sharp with unspoken things. Yeah, he said, exactly that. She moved closer to the bed, pulling the blanket gently up to Mr. Alden's shoulders. But even distance leaves traces. Your father, he's never completely gone. There's still something left in him, a part that hears, maybe remembers. Julian rubbed his temples. What am I supposed to do with all that? The anger, the disappointment, the guilt, you let yourself feel it, Maya replied. You sit with it, then one day You do something different than what was done to you. That's how it stops. Julian stared at his father's face. He wondered if there had ever been softness behind that stern jaw, behind the cold instruction. Had he ever tried, even once, to love in a way that wasn't survival? Maya reached for the photo frame she had placed on the side table the week before. It was an old picture she'd found in the back of a drawer, Mr. Alden holding a small boy in a backyard full of leaves. The boy, Julian, maybe 5 years old. She handed it to him. I found this last week, she said. I wasn't sure you'd want it. Julian stared at the photo. His younger self had a missing tooth and a crooked smile. His father looked different, not happy, but not closed off either. He was holding the child close. Julian's fingers tightened slightly on the frame. He used to carry me on his shoulders, he whispered. Only for a little while. I forgot that. Maya didn't say anything. She let him remember. And for the first time since his father had fallen ill, Julian didn't just see a failing body in a hospital bed. He saw the man who had tried in his own broken way, and the boy who had needed something more. That afternoon, he didn't leave right away. He stayed, not out of guilt, not out of duty, but because a part of him long buried and nearly forgotten had begun to stir. The storm came in suddenly that evening, black clouds rolling across the sky, the kind that swallowed light and made the world feel smaller. Maya stood by the window, watching the wind bend the trees. Thunder cracked in the distance, low and long. The lights in the hallway flickered once, then steadied. Julian arrived just as the rain began to fall. His coat was soaked at the shoulders, hair damp, but he didn't seem to care. He walked straight to room 212, his expression unreadable. When Maya saw him, she offered a towel wordlessly. He took it with a quiet thank you and sat beside his father's bed. The room dimmed as the power dipped again. This time, it didn't return. A backup generator kicked in a few seconds later, humming faintly. A few emergency lights buzzed to life. The overhead stayed off, leaving the room lit only by the glow from the hallway and the soft flash of lightning outside. Well, Maya said, pulling a chair closer. Looks like we're trapped in the dark. Julian smirked, tired but amused. Maybe that's appropriate. She sat beside him, not in her usual spot near the medical cart, but close, shoulder to shoulder. You okay? She asked gently. He paused. I don't know. That was the most honest thing he'd said all day. The room was still, save for the storm and the soft sound of the old man's breathing. I used to think I had all the time in the world, Julian said quietly. That I could always make things right later, after the next quarter, after the next deal. But I blinked. And now he's here. And I don't even know what I'm trying to fix anymore. Maya folded her hands in her lap. You're trying to say goodbye before it's too late. He looked at her, the shadows from the window playing across his face. But what if he's already gone? Then you're saying it for you, she said softly. Julian exhaled, the kind of breath that felt like surrender. When my mom got sick, Maya began, her voice steady. I was angry all the time, at the world, at her, even at myself. I wanted her to fight harder, to live longer. But sometimes people are already tired before we realize it, and what they need isn't more time. It's peace. Julian looked at his father. Peace, he repeated. He never knew how to find that. Maybe you're supposed to be the one who brings it now. They sat in the silence that followed, deeper than before. The storm howled outside, wind knocking against the window panes. But inside room 212, something steadied. Julian leaned forward, placing his hand over his father's. Dad, he whispered. I don't know if you're listening. I don't even know what to say. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving again. Maya turned her gaze to the storm, blinking back something she didn't want to name. She felt the heaviness in the air begin to shift. Sometimes healing didn't come with grand gestures. Sometimes it came in the form of a single sentence spoken in the dark. And sometimes that was enough. Morning arrived quiet and gray, the storm now only a memory. A few wet leaves clung stubbornly to the windows outside room 212, and the scent of rain still lingered in the halls. Inside, the soft clatter of porcelain broke the stillness. Maya set down a small tray on the bedside table, 2 mugs of tea, steam curling gently into the air. She didn't say anything as Julian entered. She just slid one of the mugs toward the chair he'd come to claim as his own. "Chamomile," she said softly. "Not fancy, but it helps." Julian looked at the mug, then at her. "You didn't have to." "I know," Maya said, "but I wanted to." He sat down, still in yesterday's clothes. He hadn't gone home. He didn't say it, but she could tell. Something had shifted in him, a kind of settling, as if he'd finally stopped running from the silence, from the stillness, from the truth of what this room had come to mean. Julian lifted the mug, blew softly, and took a sip. He didn't speak for a long while. He just watched his father breathe. Slow, shallow, steady. "He used to make tea like this on Sundays," Julian said eventually. "We never talked while we drank it. Just sat. That was the closest thing we had to peace." Maya smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what you're doing now." He nodded. Maybe. There was a kind of comfort in the quiet now. The weight of things no longer felt unbearable. Julian glanced at Maya, who had moved to adjust the blanket again, tucking in the edges with care. She hummed softly, nothing full, just a faint melody, like a thought with wings. Julian found himself watching her hands. They moved with purpose, but also with something else. Reverence. As if caring for his father wasn't just duty, it was love, and he realized that somewhere along the way, Maya had become more than a nurse, more than a caregiver. She had become the steady heartbeat in this room. "You do this for all your patients?" he asked quietly. "Only the ones who stay long enough to matter," she replied. Julian looked away, swallowing something thick in his throat. "He would have liked you," Maya smiled, folding a towel neatly on the side tray. "He doesn't have to like me. I'm not here to be remembered. I'm here so he doesn't have to leave this world alone." That sentence held him still. He looked at his father again, his jaw slack, eyes closed, a shadow of the man he once feared, admired, resented. Julian had come expecting to make peace with a stranger. But the longer he stayed, the more he realized this wasn't about his father anymore. It was about himself, about who he had become without love, about who he still had time to become. He reached out and placed his hand gently over the blanket, just above his father's heart. It was quiet, but there, beating. "Does it ever stop hurting?" he asked. Maya sat beside him now, her voice no louder than breath. "No, but it becomes something else. Something you carry, not something that carries you." Julian nodded slowly, and then for the first time since he'd returned to room 212, he smiled. Small, real, tired, but full of something that had been missing for far too long. Hope. The morning sun filtered through the half-open blinds, casting golden stripes across the sheets. The air in room 212 was calm, almost expectant, like the hush before something important. Maya arrived early, as always, her steps light, her expression focused. She carried a small music player in her hand and a folded flannel blanket over her arm. The weather had turned again cooler now, and the sky pale. Julian was already there. She blinked in surprise as she stepped in. He was seated at his father's side, elbows on his knees, his tie loosened, a quiet look on his face. Not grief, not guilt, just stillness. "You beat me," she said gently. He looked up. "Didn't sleep much." She set the blanket down and offered a faint smile. "Something about this room keeps people up." "I've noticed," Julian replied. Maya moved around the bed, checking vitals with quiet efficiency. Julian watched her with a kind of reverence. He no longer questioned what she did, why she smoothed the pillow even when it wasn't needed, why she spoke aloud as she worked, even though his father never answered. "Do you mind if I play something?" she asked after a while, holding up the music player. "Go ahead." She pressed play, and soft, classical piano filled the room. Not loud, not cheerful, just simple, steady, a melody that sounded like remembering. As she worked, Maya began to hum again, unconsciously matching the music's rhythm. Julian closed his eyes and listened, letting the sound blur the edges of his thoughts. Then something happened, barely noticeable. Julian opened his eyes and froze. "Wait," he said, sitting up straighter. "Did you see that?" Maya looked at him, startled. What he pointed at his father's hand. I think he moved." She stepped closer, watching carefully. Mr. Alden lay as he always had, silent, distant, a world away. But then, as if summoned by something unnamed, the fingers of his right hand twitched again. Just once. Maya's breath caught. She reached down and gently touched his palm. "Mr. Alden," she said softly, leaning closer. "It's Maya. If you can hear us, you're safe. You're not alone." Another twitch, this time slower, more deliberate. Julian stood now, his heart pounding. He reached for his father's other hand and held it gently. "Dad," he said, his voice shaking. "It's me. I'm here." There was no response, no miracle awakening, but the fingers in Maya's hand curled, barely, like the memory of a grip long forgotten. Tears welled in Julian's eyes, unexpected, uninvited. "He's still in there," he whispered. Maya nodded, her voice steady despite the ache in her throat. Sometimes the body remembers before the mind does. Sometimes it's just enough to know they're trying. Julian sat again, still holding the old man's hand. It felt warmer now, not stronger, but more present. For the rest of the morning, they didn't speak much. They just stayed watching, waiting, listening, letting the music and the light and the miracle of small movement fill the space. It wasn't recovery, it wasn't healing, but it was something. And in a room where silence had lived for too long, that something meant everything. The next day brought sunlight and stillness, the kind that lingered gently on windowsills and wrapped around the room like a warm scarf. Maya entered quietly, carrying a small wooden box with careful hands. Its corners were worn smooth with age, and the clasp clicked softly as she set it down on the side table. Julian looked up from his seat beside the bed. He'd been there since dawn. No longer out of obligation, he stayed now because leaving felt unnatural. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the box. Maya gave a small smile. "I found it in the back of the closet while sorting through old clothes. Thought it might be his." She opened the lid, revealing a handful of photographs, folded letters, a broken wristwatch, and a set of yellowed index cards tied together with string. Julian leaned forward, curious. "This one was tucked under a book," Maya said, handing him a photo. It was grainy and faded, a black and white image of a young man with a sharp jawline and fierce eyes, standing in front of an old gas station with a woman at his side. Julian studied it for a long time. "That's him," he said quietly. "And that's my mother. I've never seen this one before." Maya handed him another. This one showed a toddler sitting on a man's shoulders, both of them laughing. Julian stared, throat tightening. "I forgot he used to smile like that," he whispered. Maya sat beside him, careful not to intrude. She let him sort through the box slowly. Each item felt like a page torn from a forgotten book, a glimpse into the man behind the silence. Julian lifted one of the letters, unfolded it gently. It was dated 1986. The handwriting was his father's sharp, impatient, but unmistakably personal. "To my son, Julian, I don't know how to say these things face to face. You always expect more from me than I know how to give. But I hope one day you'll understand I was trying, clumsily, quietly. I loved you the only way I knew how. If you find this, I hope you've become a better man than I was." Julian's hands trembled as he folded the letter back. He didn't speak, his jaw locked, his eyes wet. For a long time, he simply stared at the box. Maya reached over and gently placed her hand over his. "I think he was trying too," she said. Julian nodded, slowly, as if each movement hurt. "You know," he murmured. "For years I told myself I didn't need anything from him. Not approval, not apologies, not answers. I thought I'd built my life without him. But now I look at these and I realize how wrong I was." Maya didn't speak. She didn't have to. He reached for the wristwatch and turned it over in his hand. It was old, cracked at the face, and no longer ticking. But the initials G.A. were still etched faintly into the back. His name, his father's. He carried this his whole life, Julian said. "And now," Maya replied softly, "you carry the rest." The room felt quiet again, but the silence was different now. It was full, not empty. A silence that held memory, presence, and something sacred between grief and grace. That day, Julian didn't just see a dying man in the bed. He saw his father. For the first time in years, he saw him fully. And in doing so, he began truly to forgive. It happened just before dawn. The hallway was still, washed in that pale, uncertain light that comes right before morning fully arrives. Maya had stayed the night. She hadn't meant to, but something in the air had changed. Something in the rhythm of Mr. Alden's breathing. She'd sensed it, the way caregivers do quietly, intuitively. Julian was asleep in the chair by the window, wrapped in a thin blanket Maya had placed over his shoulders hours earlier. He hadn't left his father's side in 2 days. Not for meetings, not for calls. Whatever world existed outside room 212, he had let it go. Maya sat beside Mr. Alden, gently wiping his forehead with a cool cloth, speaking softly even though his eyes hadn't opened in weeks. "You did good," she whispered. "You held on longer than most. Maybe for him." The oxygen machine hummed steadily beside the bed, but the pattern of breaths had changed. Slower, shallower, fading like music at the end of a song. Maya stood and moved to Julian, placing a hand on his shoulder. He woke immediately, blinking away the sleep. "Is it?" She nodded. He rose and crossed to the bed. His father's chest lifted one last time, then paused. There was no drama, no sudden gasp, just stillness. Julian took his father's hand and sat beside him, his jaw clenched, eyes unblinking. "I thought I'd be ready," he said after a long while, voice raw. "But I'm not. No one is," Maya said gently. He turned to her. "Thank you for not letting him die alone." Maya shook her head. "You were here. That's what matters." The room filled with silence, not empty, not cold. a silence full of presence, of things unspoken and yet deeply understood. The sky outside began to shift, soft pink streaks breaking across the early horizon. Morning light spilled slowly across the floor, touching the bed first, then the chairs, then the photo frame on the table. Julian stared at the sunlight, then back at his father's face. For the first time, he didn't just feel sorrow, he felt relief. Not because it was over, but because he had stayed, because he hadn't missed the end. He leaned forward and whispered something to the man who no longer breathed. Words Maya didn't hear, words he had carried for too long. Then he sat back, wiped his eyes, and looked at Maya. "I don't know how to say goodbye," he admitted. "You don't have to," she replied. "You already showed up. That says more than any goodbye ever could." The sun rose fully now, painting the room in soft gold. And in that light, Julian didn't feel like the son of a giant he could never please. He felt like a man who had finally come home. 2 weeks had passed since the morning Julian said goodbye. The funeral had been simple, quiet, just as Maya had predicted, Mr. Alden would have wanted. No grand speeches, no polished eulogies, just a few old friends, a weathered photo on a wooden stand, and one song played softly through a speaker. The same melody Maya had once hummed by his bedside. After the burial, Julian disappeared for a few days. No one at the facility heard from him. Maya assumed he needed space. Grief had no map, and she knew better than to try and follow someone through theirs. But then, one quiet afternoon, as she was folding towels in the staff lounge, she looked up and found him standing in the doorway. He was dressed differently now. No suit, no tie, a soft blue shirt, open at the collar, jeans, worn at the knees. His eyes looked clearer, calmer. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. Maya smiled, surprised. "Never." He walked into the room, carrying a small envelope in one hand. "I've been thinking a lot about what happens next." She said nothing, letting him speak in his own time. "I spent my whole life building things," he continued. "Companies, teams, legacy, but none of it meant anything until I sat in that room with him. And with you." Maya lowered the towel in her hands. "Julian, I want to do something that matters now," he said, holding out the envelope. "Something with meaning." She took it gently, unfolded the paper inside. It was a proposal, clear, detailed, generous, a foundation, in his father's name, focused on elder care and dignity at the end of life, music therapy, emotional support, hands-on training for caregivers like her. She looked up, stunned. "You want me to run this? I want you to lead it," he said. "You taught me more in a hospital room than anyone else has in years. You reminded me that showing up is the real work. That love isn't loud, it's steady." Maya stood still, the weight of his words resting over her shoulders like a blanket. She should have been overwhelmed, but she wasn't, not entirely, because something in her had already been preparing for this, quietly, steadily, like a seed growing in the dark. "I'm honored," she said, "truly, but I have something to tell you too." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded acceptance letter. Her voice trembled just slightly. "I got into a graduate program, music therapy and end-of-life care. I wasn't sure I'd take it, but now, after all this, I think I have to." Julian's expression softened, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Then you should. Absolutely." They stood there, two people who had been strangers only weeks before now, forever changed by one quiet room. One man's final chapter, and the music that had carried them both through it. "So," she said, a teasing smile touching her lips, What happens to your foundation? Julian grinned. It waits for you. Or maybe it grows alongside you. Maya nodded slowly, then looked out the window. The same breeze that had once rattled storm glass now stirred the trees in gentle waves. A new season was coming. Not dramatic, not loud, but certain. As she turned back to him, he said, "Do you still sing always?" She replied, "Even when no one's listening." He looked at her with a quiet intensity. "I was always listening." And with that, they stepped outside, not into a perfect ending, but into something better, a beginning.